It began with a bowl of soup, not a war, not a rebellion, not a royal decree. Just soup, thick, steaming, and stirred by the steady hands of a quiet man named Richard Roose. A cook, a nobody, and yet, within that pot, simmered not just herbs and broth, but the spark of one of Tudor England's most horrifying punishments. The year was 1531. King Henry VIII's court trembled beneath the weight of religious tension, political backstabbing, and the king's relentless obsession with divorcing Catherine of Aragon. Across the Thames, in a quieter corner of Rochester, one man stood in defiance: Bishop John Fisher, protector of the old faith, enemy of the king's new desires, and the man whose dinner would soon carry death in its depths. On February 18th, Rose, under the veil of routine, added something else to the pot. A powder, white, granular, slipped in casually, like seasoning. When questioned, he would call it a harmless prank, a purgative meant to induce some stomach discomfort. Nothing more. But two beggars who licked clean the bishop's leftovers didn't survive the night. Servants doubled over in pain, eyes rolled back, bodies convulsed. The bishop himself escaped the meal. Narrowly, rumors exploded like fire in dry fields. Whispers of poison, of betrayal, of an assassin in the kitchen. And in a kingdom already consumed by fear, such whispers didn't stay whispers for long. They rose to the ears of the king himself. And when a cook's prank reaches the throne, no one gets out clean. The pot had boiled, but it was England's blood that was about to boil next. Ready to face the truth they tried to hide? Drop "I'm ready" in the comments. Like, subscribe, and enter the fire. Richard Roose was not a man of stature, influence, or even education. He was a cook, a servant whose place was in the shadows of noble halls, never at the center of scandal or royal notice. Yet after the poisoning incident at Bishop Fisher's household, he became the focus of national fear. Brought in for questioning, Roose admitted, almost casually, that he had added a powder to the soup. He claimed it wasn't poison, just a purgative, a laxative of sorts, meant as a prank to amuse himself at the discomfort of others. He never intended harm, he said, never death. And in a time when practical jokes often took the form of uncomfortable, but usually harmless tricks, the idea wasn't unheard of. But even as he spoke, doubt settled like smoke in the air. Rose had a reputation, not for violence, but for being the sort of servant who laughed at others' misfortune. A mischief maker, a jester without a stage. That reputation made his story oddly believable, and that's what made it terrifying. Because if it was true, then a man with no ideology, no cause, and no master plan had accidentally crossed into murder. And if it wasn't true, if the joke was a lie, then something far more calculated and sinister was at play. In Tudor England, poison wasn't just a means to an end. It was considered a coward's tool, a secretive weapon used by those too weak or cunning to face their enemy openly. To poison food was not merely to kill, it was to betray the sacred act of sharing a meal. It carried a stain deeper than the act of murder by sword or dagger. Poisoners were viewed not as killers, but as moral outcasts, people who had chosen to warp the natural order. Investigators scoured for motives that might tie Rose to a political or religious cause, but they found none. There was no money exchanged, no letters, no connections to factions seeking the fall of Bishop Fisher or the destabilization of the court. Still, the timing was dangerous. England was in religious turmoil. The Reformation was creeping in, and Fisher was a vocal defender of Catholic orthodoxy. Though no evidence linked Rouse to any plot, the paranoia of the time made logic irrelevant. Truth mattered less than fear, and fear, once it takes root, spreads without boundaries. The very idea that a mere cook, a man with no title or power, could have such an impact on the political stage was almost too much for the elite to bear. It pierced the illusion of control. If someone so low in the hierarchy could strike so close to someone so high, then who was safe? It didn't matter that Rouse lacked motive. It didn't matter whether the powder was poison or purgative. The fact that it could have been enough was all that mattered. Perception took the place of proof. And so Richard Roose, with his foolish grin and stained apron, became something England had never quite seen before. An unlikely assassin. Not trained in war, not sent by spies, not moved by doctrine, just a cook with a spoon and a secret. Whether fool or fiend, his actions forced a kingdom to ask how power could be so fragile, and whether trust itself had become a danger. When King Henry VIII first heard of the poisoning at Bishop Fisher's residence, it wasn't just news of a local crime. It felt like a direct challenge to his rule. At the time, Henry was already under intense pressure. His struggle to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had thrown the kingdom into political and religious turmoil. The Pope had refused his request, and the king was growing increasingly hostile toward the Church's power over England. His relationship with the nobility, the clergy, and the people was strained. Against this backdrop, a mysterious act of poisoning, one that could have easily claimed the life of one of his most vocal religious critics, was not just a kitchen mishap. To Henry, it looked like a threat creeping into the very heart of power. What made it worse was the target. Bishop John Fisher wasn't just any clergyman. He was one of the few who had openly opposed the king's divorce and the coming break with Rome. Though Fisher survived, others did not. The fact that people had died and that it happened through something as intimate and invisible as food hit a nerve. If poison could reach a bishop, it could reach a king. The paranoia of the time didn't help. Whispers of rebellion and religious plots filled the air. Trust was scarce. Enemies were everywhere, and sometimes they wore a servant's apron. In this atmosphere, Henry's response was immediate and furious. He didn't wait for a formal trial or careful investigation. He demanded that Richard Roose be punished swiftly and publicly. The king's fury wasn't just personal, it was political. This wasn't just about punishing a criminal. It was about sending a message to anyone who might dare to defy royal authority, even indirectly. Rose's act, intentional or not, was elevated from a crime to a kind of treason. Poison, after all, wasn't merely murder. It was secretive, cowardly, and insidious. And in a world where the king was considered divinely appointed, poisoning someone so close to the heart of the church felt like an attack on the divine order itself. Henry used this incident to reinforce his power. He made it clear that in his England, justice would be what the crown decided it was. Parliament quickly passed a new law. Poisoning would now be considered high treason. And worse still, it would be punished by a new method: boiling alive. This was no accident. Boiling was theatrical, slow, and horrifying. It was designed to strip away any dignity from the condemned and leave an unforgettable image in the minds of anyone who saw it. It was the kind of punishment meant not just to kill, but to terrify. It showed that the king's anger could shape new laws overnight, and that even the most brutal of punishments were justified if royal order was threatened. As news spread, the story of Rose's crime and the king's response became the talk of every corner of England. From noble courts to village inns, people whispered about the poisoned soup and the cook who dared to tamper with life and death. But just as much, they talked about the king's rage, how swiftly it had turned fear into law, and how no one, not even a cook in a bishop's kitchen, was beyond the reach of royal wrath. In the early 1500s, English law did not treat poisoning as a distinct or especially grave crime. It was considered a form of murder, yes, but it was not legally different from stabbing, beating, or any other method of killing. There were punishments for murder, but there was no special law that made poisoning something exceptional. That changed overnight after the incident involving Richard Roose. King Henry VIII, gripped by fear and fury, was not content with the existing legal framework. He wanted to make an example, not just of the man accused, but of the act itself. Poisoning to him was too silent, too hidden, and too dangerous to be left to ordinary justice. He needed something louder, something terrifying. Henry went to Parliament, not to debate, but to command. Under his pressure, they pushed through a bill with unusual speed. This wasn't a law designed after months of discussion or built on centuries of legal tradition. It was reactive, born of royal emotion. The new statute didn't just increase the penalty, it rewrote the very category of the crime. Poisoning was now no longer just murder, it was labeled high treason, a term usually reserved for betraying the monarch or the realm. It became an attack not just on a person, but on the state itself, and that meant the punishment had to match. What shocked many was the form of that punishment: boiling alive. Unlike hanging, which was quick and already a common sentence for serious crimes, boiling was almost unheard of as a state-sanctioned punishment. It was slow, grotesque, and deeply symbolic. It wasn't chosen for efficiency, it was chosen for horror. And it wasn't random. This method was directly linked to the accused man's occupation. Richard Roose was a cook. He used a pot to commit his crime, so he would die by the pot. The law literally mirrored the act, turning the kitchen's tools of nourishment into instruments of justice. This wasn't just execution, it was theater. A cook who poisoned would be cooked. Even more unsettling was the retroactive nature of the law. Parliament made the bill apply to past acts, meaning Richard Roose was being punished by a law that did not even exist when he allegedly committed the crime. This flew in the face of English legal tradition, which had long maintained that laws could not be applied backward. You could not commit an act under one law and then be punished under a harsher one created after the fact. But in this case, that principle was tossed aside. The king's desire to make an example overrode centuries of legal restraint. It wasn't just about justice, it was about power. In passing this law, Henry didn't just create a punishment, he demonstrated how law itself could be shaped by royal will. Judges, lawyers, and even some members of Parliament who might have hesitated to endorse such an extreme measure stayed quiet. The atmosphere was heavy with fear. If the king could reach into Parliament and reshape legal reality overnight, then who would be next? Speaking out meant risking the same fate. By the end of it, the law stood not as a reflection of careful legal thinking, but as a weapon sharpened by emotion and fear. This moment exposed a dangerous truth. When rulers are afraid, the law can become a tool not of balance, but of revenge. In the heat of panic, even the rules meant to protect fairness and justice can be rewritten or erased completely. And once a precedent like this is set, it is no longer just about the crime or the criminal. It becomes about what the law is allowed to become in the hands of unchecked power. Inside the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, Richard Roose sat alone, far from any sense of mercy or fairness. Once a cook working in a quiet household, he was now seen as a symbol of danger and betrayal. From the moment he arrived, the tone of his captivity was clear. He was not treated as a man awaiting justice, but as someone already condemned. The interrogations began almost immediately, though little of what happened was ever written down. Official scribes, who normally recorded every step of legal proceedings, kept their pens still for much of what followed. Gaps in the records, long silences where there should have been words, suggested more than forgetfulness. They pointed to secrets, the kind the state didn't want remembered. In the darkness of the tower's inner rooms, Roose was subjected to forms of questioning that went far beyond words. The tools of torture were not rare in Tudor England, but their use was usually reserved for matters of national crisis. For someone accused of a single act of poisoning, the intensity of his treatment was extreme. Under pressure, Rose's confessions shifted. At times, he claimed he had poisoned the porridge accidentally. At others, he hinted that someone else had given him the substance to use. His stories didn't hold steady. They bent, cracked, and reshaped themselves as the days dragged on and the pain deepened. But in truth, any man kept under such conditions would struggle to keep his thoughts straight. The uncertainty in his statements, rather than weakening the case, was instead used to suggest hidden layers. To the Crown, each change in his account hinted at a larger, unseen plan. Despite the lack of clear evidence, the authorities treated Rose's act as the edge of a larger blade, a sign that deeper enemies might be hiding in the shadows. There were whispers of plots, though none could be proven. No names were confirmed, no letters produced, no conspirators brought forward. Still, the air of suspicion remained thick. It was as if the crime needed to be part of a conspiracy in order to justify the fury that followed. And so the assumption lingered that Rose was only the front of something much more dangerous. This belief, though never backed by facts, shaped how he was treated and sealed his fate long before any judgment was made in court. What happened to Rose behind the tower's doors was never fully revealed, and likely never will be. The lack of detailed records may have been intentional. In a world where written words could live forever, the absence of those words speaks volumes. It suggests that those in power wanted no one to know exactly what methods were used or how far they went. This silence protected the crown's image while hiding the suffering of the prisoner. Torture, when it becomes a tool of the state, often hides in darkness. And in Rose's case, that darkness swallowed nearly all traces of his experience. By the time Rose's ordeal neared its end, he was no longer the same man. His body had weakened, his mind worn thin. Whatever spirit he had when first arrested was gone, drained by pain and isolation. Yet none of this mattered to those who had already decided his guilt. His confession, whether truthful, forced, or broken, was enough. The king's will had taken on the weight of law. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for defense. In the tower's shadows, justice had become a quiet scream no one was allowed to hear. On April 5, 1531, the streets of London filled with noise and movement as Richard Roose was dragged from the tower toward Smithfield. He was bound tightly, his body weakened from the torment he had endured, his face pale and hollow. But the crowd that gathered along the route did not see a broken man. They saw a spectacle. People had come from all over, drawn by rumor, fear, and a strange hunger to witness something unforgettable. Smithfield, already known for executions, now took on the air of a cruel festival. Vendors set up wooden carts and shouted out offers of meat pies, sweet buns, and ale. Children chased each other between legs, while older men jostled for better views. For many, it was a day out, a public event that blurred the line between punishment and entertainment. In the center of the square stood the object everyone had heard about, but few could truly believe. A great iron cauldron filled with bubbling liquid, steam rising from its surface like breath from some monstrous beast. The heat could be felt even at a distance, and the stench of oil and metal already lingered in the air. Guards kept the curious back with spears, though people pressed close, unable to tear their eyes away. The authorities had made no effort to hide what was about to happen. If anything, they had arranged it to be as visible, as undeniable as possible. This was more than a punishment. It was a message, and the entire city was the audience. When Rose finally reached the square, tied to a frame and barely able to walk, the crowd shifted from murmurs to silence. Some watched with morbid excitement, others with growing unease. A few people in the front row covered their mouths as the executioners began their work. Rose was lowered toward the cauldron slowly, inch by inch. As his feet met the boiling surface, the first screams broke out, sharp, high-pitched, and terrifyingly human. His voice did not falter right away. It tore through the air in waves, rising and falling as more of his body was submerged. The screams went on, longer than many had expected. Eyewitnesses later spoke of it in fragments, of the way the skin on his legs blistered and came away, of how the stench of burned flesh turned the stomach, of how some people turned their backs while others stared harder. The heat warped the air, and the sound of bubbling mixed with the echo of human agony. It was a punishment so cruel, so foreign to English eyes, that even the most hardened onlookers struggled to absorb what they were seeing. Some women wept openly. Men, too, were said to have looked away, disturbed not only by the suffering, but by their own reaction to it. Yet others laughed or clapped, intoxicated by the spectacle, as if violence on this scale had broken some boundary in their minds. A few cried out that justice had been served, while others stood silent, unsure of what justice even meant in such a moment. When it was over and Rose no longer moved, the crowd stayed. The image burned into their memories was not just of a man dying, but of a state showing its power in the most brutal way possible. The cauldron, still simmering, remained in the square for hours. People whispered about the sound of boiling blood, the way his eyes had rolled back, the terrible endurance of pain. No sermon followed, no explanation from the crown. The act spoke for itself. Smithfield had seen executions before, but nothing like this. That day, punishment became something else entirely, something no one could forget, even if they wanted to. The air around Bishop John Fisher's residence never quite cleared after the poisoning. Though he had survived the attempt on his life, his household was not the same. Servants moved with nervous glances, meals were picked at cautiously, and the once orderly rhythm of a bishop's home was replaced by a quiet tension. The fear that had been introduced did not leave with Richard Roose. It settled in the walls, in the whispered conversations, in the way people now looked at food with suspicion. Even prayers seemed more anxious, as if seeking divine protection from invisible enemies. The house became a place of shadows, where dread lingered long after the danger had supposedly passed. Fisher himself, though physically unharmed, withdrew even further into silence. The bishop, known for his sharp intellect and moral resolve, offered no public reaction to Rose's guilt or innocence. No defense, no condemnation. His silence, heavy and deliberate, left others wondering what he truly believed. He made no plea for mercy, no call for harsher justice. Whether out of caution or principle, he kept his thoughts to himself. But silence can be louder than speech, and Fisher's refusal to speak became its own kind of statement. Those around him interpreted it in different ways. Some saw dignity, others fear. Still others believed it was political survival. Even as this fear hung around him, Fisher remained unwavering on the matter that had already placed him at odds with the most powerful man in the kingdom: the king's divorce. He continued to oppose Henry VIII's decision to break from Catherine of Aragon, refusing to support the king's plan to separate from Rome and remarry. His stance was not only public, but deeply personal, rooted in belief and loyalty. He was no rebel by nature, but his refusal to bend made him look like one. This made his survival from the poisoning feel almost ironic to some. Though he had been the intended victim, he was left alive, only to become an even greater problem for the crown. Instead of gratitude or relief, Fisher's continued presence seemed to deepen Henry's mistrust of the church. The king, already walking a path of defiance against papal authority, found in this episode further proof that the old religious order could not be trusted. The church, with its Latin prayers and silent bishops, began to look more and more like a threat rather than a spiritual ally. Fisher's endurance became a symbol of that defiance, a quiet but stubborn refusal to obey, to fall in line. And symbols, especially unbroken ones, had a way of drawing the crown's focus. Within the royal court, whispers turned to questions. Why had Fisher lived? What did his silence mean? And if the bishop could outlast poison, what else might he resist? These were not spoken in the open, but they shaped how he was seen. Even without speaking a word, Fisher's shadow grew longer in the king's mind. His quiet resistance became more dangerous than open rebellion. And though Rouse had been punished and the poison gone from the table, the unease remained. The incident marked Fisher in ways deeper than any wound could. He was now a man whose survival posed a problem. To many, he seemed protected, by faith, by chance, or by something darker. But protection is not the same as safety. The bishop continued his work, continued his prayers, but the air never cleared. The fear, the suspicion, the silence, they lingered. Every footstep in his hallways echoed with uncertainty. Though alive, Fisher now lived beneath a different kind of shadow, one cast not by poison, but by power. The two beggars who died after eating the poisoned soup are remembered by no name, no grave marker, no grieving family in the records. They pass through history not as people, but as background, footnotes to a greater political storm. Their deaths, though cruel and undeserved, quickly fade from memory. They are not granted the dignity of a trial, a prayer, or even a full sentence in most written accounts. These men, likely cold and hungry, may have only sought warmth and a meal when they entered the bishop's kitchen that day. But their fate, swift and final, served no one, not even the justice system that later claimed to avenge them. In the grand halls of power, their suffering is transformed into a symbol. Writers and clerks in the royal court mention their deaths not with compassion, but with convenience. The beggars become examples, tools to support the king's fury or justify the brutal punishment of Richard Roose. Their story is used to stir fear, to make the act seem more monstrous, but their identities are stripped away in the process. They are not mourned as individuals. No one in the court speaks of their families, their pasts, or their humanity. They are flattened into instruments of narrative, helping others advance their aims while their own lives vanish into silence. Richard Roose, the man accused and condemned for the poisonings, leaves behind almost nothing in terms of family or legacy. If he had relatives, parents, siblings, perhaps a wife or child, they disappear completely from the record after his execution. Their silence is likely not by choice. The shame of being related to a man boiled alive for treason would have been unbearable in a society obsessed with loyalty and social order. Speaking of him might have meant arrest, suspicion, or social ruin. Most families in such cases were forced to either deny any connection or vanish into quieter parts of the country. Rose's memory becomes a warning, and those closest to him become invisible, swallowed by fear and forced forgetting. The household servants who worked in the bishop's kitchen likely lived in fear long after the poison had been cleaned away. Any one of them could have been suspected, questioned, or even arrested. To have been near the soup that killed beggars and nearly killed a bishop meant being dangerously close to treason. These were not people with power or protection. They lived at the mercy of noblemen and kings. Their survival depended on silence. Speaking out, even if they knew something, could bring them under suspicion. So they said nothing. They turned their eyes downward, kept their thoughts to themselves, and did what they were told. Truth in such a time was less valuable than survival. For the commoners, the poor, the hungry, the voiceless, the poisoning incident was just another reminder that their lives held little worth in the eyes of the powerful. The beggars who died were not avenged. The servants who feared punishment received no thanks for their caution. Their suffering was either ignored or turned into spectacle. Meanwhile, the upper classes used the moment to argue, accuse, and punish one another. Justice, if it existed at all, did not reach the lower rungs of society. Commoners became characters in a royal tragedy, their lives used to support a story in which they had no say. Their grief was private, their fear unspoken, and their deaths unmarked. In the years that followed, the names of kings and bishops were written down, studied, and remembered. But the ones who died for nothing, or who lived in fear because of someone else's anger, were forgotten. Their lives mattered, but not to history. They were not just victims of poison, but of a system that treated them as less than human. Tools, background, cautionary tales. And in that silence, something important was lost. The boiling of Richard Roose was never just about one man's crime. It quickly became a warning carved into the public mind by the crown. After Roose's execution, King Henry VIII and his advisors turned the brutal spectacle into a powerful political message. It was spoken of in churches, written in pamphlets, and whispered in noble halls, not as the death of a cook, but as a sign of divine and royal justice working hand in hand. The narrative was carefully shaped. The king had acted righteously, swiftly, and with the approval of heaven. This wasn't framed as revenge or fear, it was framed as order. The king, it was said, had removed a threat not only to a bishop, but to the very soul of England. And that idea became incredibly useful to Henry. With the king pushing through marriage reforms that many saw as dangerous or heretical, there was growing unrest among the nobles and clergy. But now they had something new to fear, not just disfavor, but gruesome punishment. The boiling death was not hidden, it was made public, and its memory was kept alive through words, through imagery, and through policy. It was no accident that Rose's punishment was different from typical executions of the time. Hanging, beheading, even burning. These were well known, almost expected. But boiling? That was something new, something designed to linger in the imagination. It made people speak in hushed tones. It made the walls of power feel closer, the reach of the crown feel longer. The message was not lost on the nobility. If a mere cook could be boiled alive under a new law created just for him, then what protection did bloodlines or titles really offer? Suddenly, silence became the safest path. Those who once questioned the king's actions, his divorce from Catherine, his pursuit of Anne Boleyn, his defiance of Rome, now weighed their words with care. Some who had considered resisting began to soften their stance, not out of agreement, but out of fear. Parliament, too, became more cautious. Debates that had once stirred fierce opposition began to grow quieter. There was less room for open criticism and more space for obedience. Rose had died, but his death continued to work on the king's behalf. In sermons across the country, priests spoke of the boiling as a righteous end to wickedness. They claimed it as proof that the king's justice aligned with God's will. This religious framing gave Henry a kind of sacred authority. It wasn't just a king punishing a criminal, it was a holy man cleansing the nation of evil. For the ordinary people who heard these words each Sunday, this kind of storytelling changed how they saw authority. Resistance began to feel not just dangerous but sinful. Submission became a form of religious duty. In that climate, reforms that might once have caused outrage passed with little outcry. The execution's true purpose began to evolve. It was no longer only about a pot of poisoned broth or a bishop's dinner gone wrong. It became about power, about obedience, about reshaping a country's moral and political code. Rose, the man, faded from view, his life and motives reduced to a symbol. The boiling death became a kind of myth, a cautionary tale wrapped in fire and steam. Every noble who watched, every clerk who copied the new law, every preacher who thundered from the pulpit, they all played a part in building a new kind of silence. A silence built not on peace, but on fear. At Smithfield, where the execution of Richard Roose once drew crowds of spectators and filled the air with the smell of boiling flesh, there is now no sign of what happened. The square is part of the everyday life of London, busy, loud, and paved over with centuries of change. People walk across the very spot where a cauldron once boiled a man alive, but there is nothing to tell them of it. No plaque, no statue, not even a quiet sign in a corner. The city has allowed time to cover the place in forgetfulness. Only historians, archivists, and a few who search the deeper corners of English history remember what once took place there. The land itself holds no scars. Archaeologists have found no burned stone, no iron fittings from the execution setup, no marks in the soil to point to violence. The only clues come from documents, parliamentary records, eyewitness accounts, and legal texts passed down on paper. The ground holds its silence. This absence speaks loudly. It reveals how uncomfortable England is with some of its own past. The country that once displayed punishments as public warnings has, over time, hidden many of those moments from view. Instead of memorializing them, it has often erased or ignored them, letting them fade beneath the progress of urban life. Smithfield, once a place of fire and death, is now a place of commerce and movement. But underneath the stones and shops, the memory lingers. The screams may no longer echo in the air, but their ghost is in the silence. Each step across that space is a step over history that has been buried not by nature, but by choice. The lack of a memorial isn't just a missing object. It is a decision. It reflects the way a nation chooses what to remember and what to forget. Rose's death was brutal, unique, and deeply political. It was a moment when fear was made into law, when punishment was turned into theater. To honor that history would mean confronting the darker tools of power used in the shaping of England. It would mean facing how fear was used to control, how justice was bent to serve the needs of authority. These are difficult truths, and the absence of any public reminder at Smithfield allows them to remain hidden. The city above moves on, but the silence below still weighs heavy. Those who do learn about Roose often do so through books, not buildings. The story has survived in words, in pages of Old English law, in personal letters and chronicles. It has become a cautionary tale rather than a civic one. People may not know the location, but they know the lesson. When fear is given too much space, when leaders rule through terror rather than reason, then justice itself can become cruel. In this way, the boiling of Roose has not completely vanished. It lingers, not in the stones of Smithfield, but in the air of political memory. His death, so carefully erased from the physical world, continues to live on as a warning passed between generations. Modern Londoners may walk with phones in hand, catching buses or heading to offices, but below their hurried steps is a shadow. They do not hear the cries, but they tread the ground where fear once boiled over, where law and violence met in the open. It is a hidden chapter, sealed beneath concrete and indifference, but one that still burns in the pages of history. The silence of Smithfield is not empty. It is filled with the things a country chooses not to speak aloud.